42 is where we're going to start. Now, last time in chapter 41, we saw the assassination of Gedaliah, the governor of Judah, appointed by Babylon. And at the end of that chapter, we saw this moment where all of the Israelites were kind of hiding around Jerusalem. And they were sitting there trying to figure out what it is that they were going to do. Now, this heart is what we see at the beginning of chapter 42. The remnant of Judah they're trying to figure out what is the proper thing for us to do. And they do a wise thing. They go to Jeremiah and they ask Jeremiah to intercede on their behalf. Now, remember the Old Testament dynamic. For them, they had prophets and they had people who stood in the gap. And so there was this national need, this national heart to go to these individuals to ask them to pray for them. But now Jesus is our intercessor. You don't have to come to me or anyone else and go, will you pray for me because I don't know if my prayer will be good enough. Your prayers are good enough. You get to go directly to the king because the King of Kings stands in the gap for us. But here, they still have this dynamic where they have to go to Jeremiah. So they go to Jeremiah, ask him to go to the Lord on their behalf, and ask the king what it is that they should do. Right? So verse 4, Jeremiah promises. He tells them this. All right, but I'm going to give you the whole message that God gives me. Now, this is one of those moments that we don't want to be ugly about it, but we need to kind of point something out. Have you ever had to come alongside somebody and counsel somebody or breathe life into them, speak the words of God into them, but you get this distinct feeling that you're like the third or fourth person they've asked for advice? And you're like, okay, what is everyone else telling you that you don't want to hear them and you keep running down the road? All right? It puts this responsibility on us. We've seen this over and over again with God to Jeremiah and Jeremiah to Baruch, that whatever the message is, it is. Just give them the whole message. Why? Because perhaps they might repent. Even if you don't like the message, say it. And by this point, Jeremiah is well seasoned. I mean, this isn't like the young kid Jeremiah that I'm kind of scared of him and I don't want to say everything. Jeremiah's like, dude, whatever God tells me, I'm going to tell you. And then the people declare in verse 5 and 6 this very bold thing. They call the Lord to act as a witness against them. It's kind of this, the Lord as my witness, we will do whatever God tells us to do. And in verse 6, they really stress and clarify their intentions in this. They say, whether the instructions of the Lord are pleasant or unpleasant to us, we will do all that the Lord tells us to do. Now, if you've read ahead, you already know what's going to happen. It's going to be unpleasant to them, and they're not going to do it. But here they're claiming that they will do it all. This moment is very similar to what is recorded in Deuteronomy 5, 27 and 29. Deuteronomy 5, 27 and 29. And in that passage, Moses is recalling for Israel. He goes, remember when we were at Mount Sinai and you saw the glory of the Lord come down? And he said, you know what? We'd rather not go deal directly with God. So you go to God and you get the instructions and you come down to us and whatever he tells us to do, we'll do everything. We just don't want to go up there. And in that response, in that back and forth, the Lord in Deuteronomy laments. He goes, oh, that my people would actually have this kind of heart so that things would go well with them. Jeremiah goes and he seeks the Lord for 10 straight days, 10 days of having to wait for an answer. That's stressful. So often waiting is most definitely the hardest part. But after 10 days, the word of the Lord comes to him. He calls all of the people to him, so not just the leaders. Everyone has to be held accountable to this word. And in verse 7 through 18, Jeremiah tells them that the Lord has painted two scenarios for them. Scenario A is to submit and trust in God, to not fear the Babylonians, not fear the king of Babylon, because God is with you to save you and deliver you. So that's scenario A. But there's scenario B. And that is not trusting God. To fear man more than you fear God. To flee to Egypt thinking you can outrun the judgment to come. But in verse 16, if you decide to do that, then what you're going to find in Egypt the very sword you're hoping to avoid. For verse 17, all who have set their mind to go to Egypt will die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. Now, this declaration of God should not surprise us. God has been warning his people about trying to find their strength in Egypt since Isaiah 31. For chapters we have seen this. For prophets we've seen this. Remember that in biblical typology, Egypt is a picture of the world. It's a picture of the slavery and the lostness that God saved us from. And if that's what he saved us from, why would we ever go back to that? But God knows, and Jeremiah knows, how stubborn and wicked this people, well, all people really are. So Jeremiah tells them, even after he tells them this, he goes, you have played yourself. You secretly hoped that God would tell you what you wanted to do. You wanted God to tell you what you wanted to hear. And now you're accountable to the truth. Even though I know you have already purposed in your hearts that you are going to run to Egypt. Therefore, verse 22, that's a reason word. You should now clearly understand that you are going to die in the land where you want to flee. Chapter 43. In the first 3 verses, we're told that as soon as Jeremiah stopped talking, the leaders and the arrogant men of the people began to accuse Jeremiah of lying. And they claimed that it was poor Baruch, the scribe, who convinced Jeremiah to tell this message. Now, there's a couple things we need to see here, but first of all, we need to feel sorry for poor Baruch. That poor guy wasn't doing anything. He's just standing there next to Jeremiah. And they're accusing him of all of this. But the bigger thing that we need to notice is that it doesn't matter what a person says with their mouth, the wicked heart is going to do what a wicked heart is going to do. In verse 4 through 6, the leaders among the people took all the Jewish people out of Judah and took them to Egypt, including Jeremiah and Baruch, who didn't want to go. So they're kidnapped and taken hostage and taken all the way down to Egypt. But just because they were in a foreign country does not mean that the word of the Lord suddenly stopped. Isaiah 40, verse 8. Isaiah 40, verse 8. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God stands forever. So while they are in Egypt, what happens? The word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah. And God tells Jeremiah to bury some large stones in the pavement in front of the entrance of Pharaoh's palace that's in Tapanis, and to declare to the people that the Lord is going to send to Nebuchadnezzar and bring him down to Egypt. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to set up his throne in front of that palace on top of those very stones. Now, what's interesting about this is in Jeremiah 37, we saw Babylon go and fight with Egypt. Remember, they had surrounded Jerusalem. The siege is lifted because the Egyptian army is coming up. Nebuchadnezzar stops what he's doing. He lifts the siege, and he goes and he fights against the Egyptians, and he defeats them there. But he doesn't go to Egypt then. He comes right back to Jerusalem because he's like, I am tired of Jerusalem. I'm not doing this again. We're already here. We're going to handle this first. That conquest of Egypt comes later, just in time for Judah to get down to Egypt. So if they had just done what they were supposed to do, then the judgment would have gone right by them. But instead, they ran and got in front of judgment yet again. All they've done is make sure that they're in the firing line when Babylon comes through. Chapter 44. In verse 1, we see that the word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah yet again while the people are in Egypt. And first, God reminds them, you have already seen how this works. You saw the judgment of God come down upon Judah, upon Jerusalem, because of the wickedness and pagan worship that they flaunted before God. I warned you again and again, but you would not listen. Therefore, I poured out my anger upon you. So if you witnessed all of that once, why are you doing the exact same thing again? Why did they not only go down to Egypt against the command of the Lord, but once you got there, you started to worship foreign gods? Now watch this. Watch this arrogance. Watch this wickedness. God tells them in verse 11, he's going to set his face against them for woe. He's going to decimate the remnant of Judah in Egypt so that only the tiniest remnant of the tiniest remnant will remain. And starting in verse 15, the men of Egypt will show, or the men of Judah who are in Egypt will show how utterly wicked and arrogant they are. Please understand this. Whatever your struggle, whatever your condition, arrogance only makes it worse. God can't do, or he won't do, anything with arrogance. But if you're struggling and there's humility in your heart, he can do so much with a humble heart. He can do nothing with arrogance. And their response to this warning by the Lord is so pompous, is so smug. They tell Jeremiah, we will not listen. We will not listen to God. We will keep doing what we've done because according to them, our problems didn't start until we stopped offering to pagan gods. They go, back when we used to do this, things were great. It's only after we stopped, verse 18, that the hard times began. Then in verse 19, the women chime in. And they declare what we are told in verse 15, right? Didn't our husbands fully know what we were doing? They were like, it's not like we did this on our own. What the women are doing here is they're trying to use their husbands for cover. That somehow their husbands being complicit in their sin excuse their sin, but Adam's failure in the garden didn't prevent Eve from getting kicked out too. And using their husband's knowledge as an excuse doesn't help the women here. Our relationship with God is a personal one. It depends upon us and him, us and them. In verse 20, Jeremiah tells the remnant that God was aware of what they've been doing, but he was patient and long-suffering, hoping that they would repent. And here comes the wickedness of man's heart that takes the patience of God to be the permission of God. That the fact that he doesn't immediately crush you the second you sin somehow in my head means, well, it's okay what I'm doing. But I am quickly reminded when I look at this, not only to not take the patience of God as his permission to sin, because it is never permission to sin, but when I cry out for immediate punishment of God upon the wicked, to be reminded that it was the long-suffering nature of God that gave me the opportunity to repent. That he waited to allow me to turn from my sin, that opportunity to produce fruit consistent and worthy of repentance with tears and with ashes, so that God could extend his forgiveness to me. That's what God did for them and for their forefathers. He waited and waited until verse 22, he could not wait anymore. He could not endure anymore. Here's the thing about long-suffering that so many forget. Long-suffering means it's long-suffering until it stops. And patience means that at some point there's an end. Now, for his children, he is extremely patient for a long period of time. But at some point, he has to stop being patient. He has to judge sin because he is a holy God. In verse 23, Jeremiah corrects their incorrect assertion in verse 17 and 18. He goes, it's because you sinned against God that calamity has befallen you. Then powerfully, soberly, Jeremiah tells the remnant, and everyone who said, we will certainly worship foreign gods, God tells them through Jeremiah, verse 25, you know what? You go ahead and do what you want to do, but actions have consequences. And if you mess around, you will find out. And I, the Lord, have sworn by my great name. And remember, is there anything higher than his name? Is there anything greater than him swearing by himself? This is the highest oath he can possibly say. And he goes this, if you decide to do this, I will not even allow you to put my name in your mouth anymore. And this will be a sign to the remnant to know that God was surely going to punish them. They would watch the fall of the Pharaoh of Egypt into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 45. The end of chapter 44 kind of forms an end to the real-time prophecy of Jeremiah, if you will. So even though it's not in chronological order, there's kind of this feel of beginning to end kind of thing, but it stops at the end of chapter 44. Chapter 45 to the end of chapter 51 kind of forms this, I can't think of a better word for it, an addendum, if you will. Like this additional book that gets added on to the end of it. And what it is, it's going to be a list of prophecies to various people groups and nations who surround Israel. Our first prophetic statement in this series is a bit of to a surprise audience. It's God speaking to Baruch. You're like, wait a minute, I thought we were going to deal with nations. He goes, yeah, but we've got to handle something at home first. This isn't so much to the Jewish people as a whole, but it's a specific one during the reign of Jehoiakim to Baruch. Since chapter 32, Baruch has been Jeremiah's only close companion. He's the only guy who's kind of partnered up with Jeremiah through all of this. But under the reign of Jehoiakim, things started to get hard for the duo. If you remember in chapter 36, Jeremiah and Baruch have to go into hiding. Jeremiah had dictated a scroll to Baruch. Baruch went and read it out. The scroll was taken to King Jehoiakim, and what did he do? As it was being read out, he was cutting off portions of it and burning it, and then he demanded for Jeremiah and Baruch to be brought to him, so they had to go into hiding. And it seems like maybe during this time that Baruch started to have this thought in his head that went, you know what, this stinks. I think I deserve better than this. So God calls him on it in verse 4. And verse 4 is an incredibly important verse as God says, this is what I'm about to do. And God is warning Baruch that judgment was coming. And if Baruch is choosing to seek for himself great things That's not good. Because what good is a comfortable life when the judgment of God falls down? Jesus asked us this in Mark chapter 8. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world just to lose his soul? So God tells Baruch in verse 5, but are you seeking great things for yourself? Seek them not. Do not seek out great things for yourself. You are going to keep your life during what is about to come. And you need to be satisfied with what I give you. Chapter 46. Starting in verse 1 and continuing to the last verse of 51, we have this series of prophecies to the list of nations that I mentioned. And these are going to be uttered across the multi-generational ministry of Jeremiah. We're not sure exactly when all of these are done. Some of them have sort of time markers, some of them don't. And it seems like it was just kind of scattered all over the place. But what this section does is it acts as a counterbalance to the chapters and chapters of this book where it's felt like Judah has been the only focus. Like they were the only ones being wicked in the whole world. And after that many chapters, it can be kind of hard. You know, we love the people of God. We love Israel. We love the Jewish people. And we see all these things coming against him. We're like, oh, it's just so heavy. And God goes, listen, but they're not the only ones. And I see all the sin of the world, and all sin will be judged. While accountability starts at home and it starts at the top, it doesn't mean that while God is judging his people that he has overlooked or forgotten the sin of the rest of the world. In this sequence, God starts with Egypt. During the time when Jehoiakim was Judah's king, so this is about 3.5 years after the death of the good king Josiah. And at that time, Pharaoh Necho in Egypt appeared to be the big power broker in Judah's part of the world. They had already defeated the army of Judah underneath Josiah, displaced one king and took him captive, and then put another one on the throne. And Judah started to think that Egypt would be the big brother who would keep them safe. If they could just make a deal with Egypt, if they could compromise or hide in Egypt, then they would be safe. And we see the same attitude continue even after the fall of Judah. And because, again, in biblical typology, Egypt is a picture of the world. It's a picture of the lostness and bondage that God saved us from. We are never to return to Egypt and to seek to gather our strength there. This is a rule we will see clearly communicated to the future kings of Israel in Deuteronomy 17:16. Deuteronomy 17:16, where God tells Israel before they even have kings that your kings are not to lead you back to Egypt from where you came. Why would we ever go back to the world when that's what God saved us from? And in order to show that they should not be a reservoir of strength to you, in verse 3 and 4, Egypt is called to battle. It's like God saying, put up your dukes. Man up and fight. Let's see what you're really made of. And here's the result in verse 5. They all run and hide. Verse 6, no one in their army will escape judgment. In verse 7 and the first half of verse 8, it's Egypt talking about themselves. Egypt thinks they're going to rise up like the Nile. They're going to cover the lands around them. But at the end of verse 8, God reveals, no. I am the one who's going to cover you. In verse 9, God invites the allies of Egypt to go up and fight. For verse 10, the day belongs to the Lord, and God will avenge himself on his foes. Then in verse 13, we have a second message against Egypt. So verses 2 through 12 was the first one. And verse 13 through 26 is the second. And this second one clarifies God is bringing Nebuchadnezzar to crush the land of Egypt. Verse 15 emphasizes that even though it's the Babylonians who are coming, it's actually the Lord who's going to knock them down. And now they can't seem to get back up. In verse 17, the people say that Pharaoh is but a big noise. In other words, he's all bark and no bite. He's all hat, but he's no cattle. In verse 18 and 19, God declares that Babylon is coming like a mountain, that Egypt is like a prize cow, but this one little horsefly from the north is going to send her running. Verse 22 and 23 disguise Babylon like this giant serpent. And when you get closer to the serpent, you'll see it closer, it's actually this army of woodcutters that's going to come and cut down all the trees of Egypt. They're like a swarm of locusts that are too numerous to count. In verse 25, God again clarifies that he is the one who is punishing Egypt. That will become a common theme that we'll see with many of the prophecies in this section, where God keeps going, your fight is not with them, your fight is with me. And that now in this place with Egypt, it is much like Exodus 12:12. Exodus 12:12, where God is going to judge both the men of Egypt and he's going to judge their false gods. But verse 27 through 28, God talks to his people in the midst of this. He doesn't want his people to fear. That while God is going to judge Egypt, he is with Israel and he will save them. That God is going to judge the nations to wherever he has driven them. But even though he's going to judge these foreign nations, do not get it twisted still. You still have to be purified. And your chastening will not end before its time. Chapter 47. Here in verses 2 through 7, we have a very brief, very succinct word against the Philistines, the ancient enemy of Israel. And verse 2 tells us that Babylon is going to crush them. Verse 4 tells us that the result of that day will be that all the Philistines will be destroyed. And I want you to just kind of focus in on that and understand it. It's a very bold moment to highlight that the Philistines are no more. After this, there are no more Philistines. And the Palestinians that you see in the news are of Arab descent. They're not Palestinians. And we know that because the Palestinians themselves are descendants of the seafaring people of Crete. The actual Palestinians were closer to the Greeks than they are to the area. They came across the Mediterranean Sea. They settled on the coast that we think of as Gaza right now. And they planted themselves there and became this in constant agitation to the Jewish people. Chapter 48. Chapter 48 is one long prophecy against the Moabites. And it might surprise us because we're like, why is all this against them? What have they been doing all this time? But the reason why God is going to spend so much time on them is because of what we see in verse 7, 26, 29, and 42. And in my Bible, next to 7, 26, 29, 42, I have one word written down, arrogance. This is why they have such a large portion against them. It's because of their arrogance, because of their pride, because they trusted in their treasure and they trusted in their false gods, and they became arrogant against the Lord. In verse 1, we see the first woe declared against Moab. That while Babylon will be the destroyer who comes later in this chapter, verse 2 tells us that their doom was devised in Heshbon, which is an Amorite city. So the idea is that your enemies are near and far. The people on your borders as well as the people who are far away. In verse 6, the people are told to flee because they have trusted in their achievements and their treasures. And they and their false god, that's Shemosh in verse 7, they will both go into exile. In verse 8, the destroyer will go to every city. Now, Moab was in a beautiful place for defense. On the west coast, they had the Dead Sea. On the eastern border for them, they had the desert. So there was almost no way to attack them. Almost everybody who went by this area always went through Israel. They went along the coastlines and along those places that were easier to walk. But here, this destroyer is going to come, and he's going to go through everything. Verse 11 is really, really neat. There's super neat pictures inside of this. All right, we see where God describes you've had a very easy life ever since your youth. You're used to sitting back and relaxing while other nations suffered. And then he talks about this. You've been allowed to settle on your dregs, your wine that's been allowed to sit in your casket or in your bottle, and you just sit there on your dregs. Now, part of the idea is that you've been allowed to age. No one stirred you up. And that sounds great. Isn't that what you want to do with wine? Here's the problem. At certain parts of the process, in the fermentation process, you have to filter the wine from the junk that gets into the solution as you're squishing it and pushing it out. So little bits of the grape skin, little bits of the stem or whatever it is. And if you leave it in there for a certain amount of time, it adds flavor to the wine. So that's awesome. But if you leave it too long, it turns the solution sour and putrid. It actually causes it to spoil. And so from time to time, it has to be poured from one vessel to the next vessel through a filtering process to get that junk out, which is why you haven't been poured out, emptied from vessel to vessel. He goes, so you become putrid. You become spoiled. You're no longer trying to purify yourself and get closer to me. But don't worry. In verse 12, I'm going to send for the guy who knocks down jars. I'm going to send for the guy who breaks them on the floor because you wouldn't purify yourself anymore. You wouldn't get this junk out of your life. I'm just going to break all the bottles. Because of Moab's pagan worship, Moab will be put to shame, just like Israel was put to shame for the golden calf that they worshipped at Bethel. That's why there's a reference to Bethel here. That's one of the two locations. One was up in Dan, but the other was in Bethel, where a golden calf was found. And that's 1 Kings 12, 28 through 29. 1 Kings 12, 28 through 29, that we have that reference. In verse 14 and 15, God asks Moab how they can say that they have mighty warriors when all their warriors have been struck down. Verse 18, we see a major city of Moab will be conquered. And in verse 19, we have this reference to the city of Aroer, which is like way out in the boonies. And they're going to see people coming, and they're going to ask them, what's going on? Where do you guys all come from? And they're going to reply that Moab has been put to shame. So these are refugees coming out of that city. And they're having to flee all the way out into the country. And the people of the country are going, what are you doing out here? And that's the answer they give. In verse 25, we see the strength of leadership of Moab will be broken. Verse 26 shows us that Moab will become arrogant, or has become arrogant toward the Lord. Verse 27, they mocked Israel because of how Israel was judged. This is part of arrogance. Arrogance thinks you're untouchable, but no, they're the bad ones. They needed to be judged. They didn't see what happened to Israel and took it as a sober warning. That's a big part. That's going to be part of the heart against Edom as well. You didn't see what I was doing there and then take the opportunity to repent. And instead, verse 29, please, look how many times we're going to see these words in here. They become proud, very proud. So proud that even the Jews remaining in Judah heard about their haughtiness and their arrogance and their pride. How many ways can God say it in a single verse? In verse 30, God says, yeah, I know about Moab's talk, but it all amounts to nothing. Verse 31, 32, and then verse 36 and 37, we see Jeremiah weeping for Moab because his heart is broken for them. And when you see Jeremiah weeping, it's not just Jeremiah weeping, it is Jeremiah as the stand-in for God weeping over what must be done. But in verse 38, God tells Jeremiah that the people are already mourning in Moab because the Lord has broken them like an undesirable vessel. Verse 40, God describes that Babylon is coming like an eagle. Verse 44 tells us that the one who tries to hide or tries to run will fall into a pit. The one who climbs out of a pit will be caught in a snare. And the idea is there is no escape. It doesn't matter what you try to do. This judgment is coming for you. In verse 46, we have the final woe upon Moab. God calls them the people of Shemesh, again, referring to their foreign god. And yet somehow, this is going to be purifying for them. As in the latter days, God will restore their fortunes again. Now, the idea of the latter days is a very, very broad statement. It is connected to the great and terrible day of the Lord. And what it exactly means as far as timeline, we're not totally sure, but sometime just before the Great Tribulation or just after, maybe in the millennial kingdom, Moab is going to be raised up again. But when you think the idea of the latter days, think around the rapture of the church and the beginning of the Great Tribulation. Because that is what the day of the Lord is. It is that time period between the time where he takes his church up into the clouds until Jesus returns and sits on his throne. And that time period is the great and terrible day of the Lord. And the days around it there are known as the latter days. Now we will see this promise to reestablish Moab and Ammon and Elam, those three nations in particular. That's interesting. We'll kind of talk about that in a second. But the bigger thing is that it won't be applied to Edom. Edom is the only direct sister nation for Israel. Israel is the descendants of Jacob, and Edom are the descendants of Esau, and yet one is going to be brought forward and brought through all of this by the Lord, and the other one is going to be cast away. But chapter 49 first. In verse 1 through 6, we have the judgment against Ammon. They get a very small portion compared to what Moab has. And the accusation starts in verse 1. God goes this, has Israel run out of sons? Are they out of people? Is that why you have started to live in the land that I gave to them? Now, this is the problem. When Assyria came and took the northern tribes, and they took the portion of the land over to the east of the Jordan River, what the other nations do is they started to move in on the territory. Well, this is free real estate. And as they move in, God goes, what do you think you're doing? I gave this land to my people. Why are you trying to live in the possession I gave to them? Therefore, because of your hubris, God is going to judge Ammon. Because of her boast, that's verse 4, because she trusted in her treasure, so again we have this pride and this arrogance, God is going to bring terror upon them. But afterward, again, just like Moab, God is going to restore them. And it may be, this promise to restore Moab and Ammon specifically, may be because they're both descendant peoples from Lot. And so maybe this is a blessing to Abraham that he's doing this and bringing these people back, but that is just a guess. In verse 7 through 22, we have this large prophecy against Edom. Verse 8, we're reminded what? These are the people descended from Esau, so this is the sister nation to Israel. The reason that matters is that of all the people outside of Israel, they should have been the ones most sensitive, most desiring to be obedient to the Lord, but they weren't. They refused and they insisted instead upon rebelling against Babylon. Now, do you see verse 12? And this kind of almost like clunky English sentence about those who are not condemned to drink will drink. What makes you think that you won't drink? And you're like, what is he talking about? This is a reference to Jeremiah 25, verses 17 through 18. Jeremiah 25, verses 17 through 18. In that chapter, Jeremiah is given a cup from the Lord, and he's told to go to this meeting of all the ambassadors and kings that were down in Jerusalem, and he was to command them to drink from this cup because it represented the coming judgment of Babylon. And if they refused to drink, he was to tell them, you will surely drink. That was the idea. And inside of that was this long list of nations that were in the meeting that were going to be given this command. And among those nations were Egypt, Philistia, Moab, and Ammon, who we've already seen, and Elam, that we'll see in a minute. They are all condemned to drink from that cup. God said, you will surely drink from this. And another nation was in that list, Edom, that we see right here. So what God is saying is, the nations that aren't even on the list, that we'll see in a minute, like Damascus, they're going to have to drink from this cup. So if nations who aren't even on the list are going to have to drink from this cup, what makes you think you who are on the list can get away from it? You will drink from this cup as well. You will not avoid the judgment to come. In verse 16, though, Edom has convinced themselves we can hide in the rocks. We can hide in the rocky clefts and in our rock fortress of Petra. But God tells them he's going to bring you down from there. Verse 17, Edom will become an object of horror. Verse 19 is very, very important. It's going to be repeated almost verbatim in chapter 50 as part of the judgment against Babylon. This idea of who is like me, who can stand against me, who calls for me and then makes me show up. And I think that the reason that this particular statement is applied to both Edom and to Babylon is they have both convinced themselves that they can escape judgment. Edom by boasting in their rock fortress, Babylon by boasting in their strength. And in both cases, God looks at these two nations and asks them, who is like me, who can stand against me? Last thing to note, I want to remind you again, God does not promise to restore Edom to the land. God does not he does promise to preserve their orphans and their widows as a mercy to them, but they do not receive the promise of restoration to the land as a national force again, like Moab and Ammon and Elam will. In verse 23 through 27, God declares judgment upon Damascus, which is the largest city-state in the modern Syria area. They kind of act as the template for that entire area. And the reason that we have Damascus here, as well as the nomadic kingdoms in verses 28 through 33, they may be examples of those from verse 12 that were not condemned to drink from the cup. They're not in the list of nations in Jeremiah that we saw earlier. But they will be affected. They will drink of the cup anyway. But like we said, Egypt, Philistia, Ammon, Moab, and Elam were all mentioned in that message. Okay, in verse 28 through 33, we have the judgment upon the kingdoms of Kedar and Hazor. These are semi-nomadic tribes in the Arabian Peninsula in that era. So these are Arabs that have nomadic tribes, but they also have central cities as well. They kind of act like their capital. But they're not fortified. They don't have walls. It's one of the statements within there. But they're also going to be affected. They're going to be told to flee. God's saying, I'm going to give this land to Nebuchadnezzar, so you guys need to get out of the area too. In verse 34 through 39, we have this judgment upon Elam. Now, if you don't know where Elam is, I don't blame you. But Elam is, if you think about where Iraq is on one side and Iran is on the other side, okay, so this way, all right? Iraq's here and Iran's here. In the middle of them is the Persian Gulf that kind of comes right towards the middle, and you could draw a line up. Right along that line is where the city of Elam is, and the Elamites were in that area. Now, one of the neat things is about this city that we don't know very little about, we don't think about often, there's going to be Jews who are going to relocate there, and Jews from that area are going to come down to Jerusalem on Pentecost and be saved. But they're declaring this judgment upon them. They're going to be absorbed by the Babylonian Empire as well. But after that, after they're shattered before their enemies, in verse 39, we see God will restore them in the last days. And I don't know why. It's not clear why he has this grace for this particular group, but God said it, so I believe it. Chapter 50. Now we're going to get down to brass tacks. 50 and 51 are one large prophecy against Babylon. And the ultimate reason for this judgment at this time is found in chapter 51. So would you turn over in your Bibles, chapter 51, and look at verse 60, please. And I'm going to start reading there so we can kind of see what the purpose of all this is. So Jeremiah 51, starting in verse 60. So Jeremiah wrote in a single scroll all the calamity that would come upon Babylon. That is, all these words which have been written concerning Babylon. That's chapter 50 and 51. Verse 61. Then Jeremiah said to Sariah, as soon as you come to Babylon, then see that you read all these words aloud and say, you, O Lord, have promised concerning this place to cut it off, so that there will be nothing dwelling in it, whether man or beast, but it will be a perpetual desolation. And as soon as you finish reading this scroll, tie a stone to it and throw it into the middle of the Euphrates and say, just so shall Babylon sink down and not rise again, because of the calamity that I am going to bring upon her. Now, what is happening is that the first two waves of exiles have already gone. And here, during the 4th year or something like that of King Zedekiah, he sends a detachment, including himself, to go out to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, what we think is going on is that there's already been one attempt to kind of like either assassinate Nebuchadnezzar or to have a coup against him. So kings that want to stay on his good side are heading up there to kiss the ring and to bow the knee and all that kind of good stuff. So Jeremiah knows that there's a Jewish contingent up there, and he gives Sariah this letter to go up there and to read to the exiles, because God wants the Jewish exiles to know, I am going to judge Babylon. It will happen eventually. 70 years and all that. But it is going to come. I don't want you to lose hope. Now, do you see this image in verse 63 and 64 of chapter 51? The scroll is tied to a rock. The rock is thrown into the middle of the Euphrates. Do we have another image in the Bible of someone throwing a rock into water and declaring judgment upon Babylon? Revelation 18:21. Revelation 18:21. When we were told that John sees a strong angel pick up a large rock, and he throws it into the Mediterranean Sea, and he declares, just like this, Babylon will be thrown down. Now, if you see that symmetry, I want you to understand something. That this judgment upon Babylon has already been fulfilled as a near-term fulfillment when the Babylonians fell to the Medo-Persian Empire. But there will be a final fulfillment of this fall of Babylon. And we will read about it in Revelation chapter 18 when we see the future fall of Babylon, when it is the world ruling system for the Antichrist. Now that we kind of get our bearings just a little bit, we understand the purpose of this letter. Now let's go back to chapter 50. And in verses 1 through 3, we see that God declares that he is going to raise up a nation to Babylon's north, and they will bring God's judgment upon Babylon. Verse 4 through 5, God describes how the Jewish people will come out of Babylon. They will return to Zion, so that when you see Zion, that's a reference to Jerusalem. And they will join themselves in an everlasting covenant with the Lord. Has the Jewish nation as a whole done that yet? No. They won't do it until Jesus comes back the second time. And we'll see that in Zechariah. So that is a reference to the millennial kingdom. So there's elements within this that have already been completed, but they will be more fully completed when Jesus returns. Verse 6 explains how the Jewish people got to where they are. They were misled by unfaithful servants. And while the flock of God was scattered abroad, verse 7 tells us that they were taken advantage of by these nations around them, like Babylon. And these nations who took advantage of Israel's wayward condition will try to plead innocence and say, well, it's not our fault we oppressed them. It's their fault. They're the ones who sinned against God. In verse 8 through 10, God is going to raise up a horde of nations against Babylon. Why? Because of verse 11. Because you took joy in being the instrument of God's judgment. There is faithfulness, but then there is glee. There is joy in being allowed to inflict punishment on someone else and call it the name of the Lord. There was no pity in their heart for the people of God, and that was an issue, and they have to be judged for that. In verse 14 through 16, God gives instructions to the coalition of nations that he's raising against Babylon. In verse 17, Israel is scattered. Why? Because Assyria and Babylon scattered them. So both of these world empires at the time are being addressed. One came for the northern kingdom, the other one came for the southern kingdom. Therefore, because they have done this to God's people, verse 18, God is going to punish these wicked nations who took delight in oppressing Israel. Verse 19 through 20, God is going to bring his people back to their land. But look in verse 20. Verse 20 is worthy of a long study all its own. In the midst of all of this, the judgment that Israel has endured, judgment going on other peoples as well, all this kind of stuff happening at the same time, we have a verse like this where God says, in those days when I restore my people, when I bring them back, search will be made for the iniquity of Israel, but there will be none. No one will be able to find it. They will look for the sins of Judah, but those sins will not be found. And look at this. For I will pardon those whom I leave as a remnant. This is a magnificent promise from the Lord. It is an Old Testament promise to Israel, but we can freely apply it to us. Why? Because we see the same promise repeated in the New Testament. In passages like 1 John 1:9. This is such an important promise from the Father. It's the promise that the blood of Jesus washes us whiter than snow. In verse 23, God describes Babylon as the hammer of the whole world. It's a really neat description. But now that hammer has been cast off. The idea is almost like it's been just thrown into the corner of the room. It's been broken. It's been cut off. And in verse 24 and 25, God makes clear, I am the one who is against you. Verse 26 and 27, God is again calling to those who will attack Babylon. Verse 28, we see the displaced Jewish refugees from Babylon returning to Jerusalem, declaring they have seen the vengeance of God poured out. Now, in this first part, God again commands the nations to move against Israel of verse 29, right? Summon many against Babylon. But in the end of verse 29, all the way to verse 32, God stresses that the issue is that they have become arrogant against God. How many times have we seen this so far in the nations that we have before us? This is always the issue. If God uses you to be his instrument of whatever, do so with a humble heart and learn the lesson. The lesson when you have to say a hard word is never, I'm great and you're bad and you need to fix you. The lesson is always, you need to be humble before the Lord and I need to be humble too. When you get to tell the lesson, that means you learn it at least twice. When God places it in your heart and when you say it out loud. It's the lesson that teachers always know. You learn it first and then you apply it. But some people who feel like they have a word from the Lord means, well, I'm just the megaphone. None of this applies to me. It always applies to you. But arrogance is an issue. Therefore, verse 31, God is against you. And what does he call him? O arrogant one. Verse 33 and 34, God declares that he knows that his people are oppressed, that those who took him captives have held them fast. But verse 34, this is a great one to underline, their Redeemer is strong, the Lord of hosts is his name. And when we see Lord of hosts, that is a reference to God's what? His military position. He is the leader and the commander of angel armies. And he goes, you are holding on to my people, but you do not know who you are messing with. In verse 35 through 37, God says 5 times, a sword is coming for the Chaldeans. Now, he just used his military name, and what does he do? Oh, yeah, and I got a bunch of swords, and I'm sending them all after you. Another place we see that God is going into his armory to address this. These are the swords that are coming out. But what this may be, just maybe, this is Anthony thinking, is maybe this is a reference to the sword of the Lord that we saw earlier in Jeremiah 47, verse 6 and 7. But we don't have time to get into that now. All right, verse 38. Babylon is called a land of idols. This is where he sent his people to. Verse 39 through 40, the land will end up being desolate. Verse 41 through 43, the future king of Babylon will hear about the coming army, will go limp with fear. We'll see that later in the book of Daniel. Verse 44 is a repeat of Jeremiah 49:19. That's the one we talked about earlier, right? And then verse 45, God commands for people to hear his plan, that to know that when they hear the shout, Babylon has been seized, the earth will shake. And we will see this similar shout happen in Revelation 14:8 and 18:10. Revelation 14:8 and 18:10, when future Babylon is finally overthrown. Chapter 51. Now, I know there's almost no chance that you can read out all that. And I know that it looks even tinier on your piece of paper. But I know that as good students, you're not relying upon my notes for your summers. That you are going through and you are fleshing it out all yourself so that no one is going to complain to me that it's too small to read. In this chapter in 51, God is going to show how completely he is going to destroy Babylon. This is the idea of threshing. This is the idea of finally grinding something. That you don't only go over it one time, you go over it again and again and again until it's into the smallest particles that it can be. And that is what chapter 51 is. In verse 1, God arouses against Babylon the spirit of the destroyer. How many times in just the book of Jeremiah have we seen Babylon referred to as the destroyer? Now the destroyer is coming for them. They thought all this time that they were the big bad. They had no idea what was going on. Verse 5 is a beautiful, beautiful verse. Hold on to verses like this. Neither Israel nor Judah has been forsaken by God, even though their land is full of sin. So what's the lesson? Even when you mess up, God is not done with you. Even though you struggle with sin and you are defiled by it, your Father in heaven does not cast you away. There is wonderful reassurance in that verse. It is not a license to sin. If you think it's a license to sin, you got bigger issues. But for the child that messes up and cries and hears this whisper from the enemy, that I don't know if he says it to you, but he says it to me all the time, but it's this: he'll never take you back now. And the devil is a liar. Because we're told right here that the people of God are not forsaken, even though their land is full of sin. In verse 6, the people of God are told to flee from Babylon. It's going to be echoed in Revelation 18:4. Revelation 18:4, when God calls them and goes, "Come out of her, my people." So we have the same call here in Jeremiah. In verse 7 and 8, previously Babylon has been the cup in the Lord's hand, but now they have been cast aside. This reference to a cup that made the nations go mad may be a reference to Revelation 18:3, when we're told that Babylon has this cup, and as the harlot has given it out, and nations have drunk from it and become immoral. Verse 9 could be a reference to the kings of the earth who weep over the system of Babylon in Revelation 18:9. Revelation 18:9, and they're like, we tried to put her back together, but it just wouldn't work anymore. And in verse 10, the Jewish people proclaim that their God has vindicated them. Verse 11 and 12 seems to be a command to the Medes and the Persians who will conquer Babylon. Verse 12 through 14 is a statement of the Lord's intent against Babylon, what he's going to do. Now, and starting in verse 15, we have this really neat back and forth. All right, 15 and 16 shows the glory and the supremacy of God. But mankind and his idols are stupid and lifeless compared to God. That's verse 17 through 19. Verse 20 through 23, God describes how he once used Babylon, but verse 24, now he must judge them for what they did against Judah. In verse 27 and 28, God calls the nations against Babylon. Verse 30, the mighty men of Babylon are too tired and they're too afraid to keep fighting. Babylon is losing so many cities so fast that the messengers that are all bringing news of the defeats are starting to run into each other. That's how many are filling up the roads. Verse 34 through 35, the Jews petition God, and they tell him how Babylon devoured them. We were like a cup, and he just drank us dry. In verse 36 through 40, this is important. God tells them, I will plead your case. The idea is, I will be your advocate. I'm going to be in your corner. I'm going to be the one to fight for you. And I will deliver the Babylonians to the lions, and they're going to be like little lambs led to the slaughter. Verse 41 through 44, God describes the judgment upon Babylon, their cities, their people, their false gods. Verse 45, we see again a call to the Jewish people to come out of Babylon. Don't stay there. Don't lose heart when you see what I'm going to do. He's telling him, I'm the one who is punishing the idols and the land of Babylon. In verse 49, God says that Babylon has to fall for those they killed in Israel and those they killed everywhere else. The Jews who are in exile are commanded to remember in Jerusalem, but here's the problem, verse 51. When they think about Jerusalem, they go, we're ashamed. We think about how our city is defiled, how it has fallen. Why? Because of our sin. We caused this. Verse 52 through 58, God reiterates that he's going to utterly judge and destroy Babylon. Again, this is fine grinding. Why does he keep saying it? Because each time is a different path. He is going to bring them down until they're fine dust. And in verse 59 through 64, we end where we began just a minute ago with Jeremiah instructing Sariah, the quartermaster for Zedekiah, to read the scroll to the exiles in Babylon, then to tie it to a stone and to throw it into the river. Chapter 52. What we have in this chapter is a very close retelling of 2 Kings 24, verse 18 through 25 through 21. So again, that's 2 Kings 24, 18 through 25 through 21. That's the record of the fall of Jerusalem in the book of 2 Kings. This picture is the picture we have going into the book of Lamentations. When we go into Lamentations the next time we meet on AC3, we're going to see Jeremiah just crying, this is why. He's thinking about this. This is the image. That's why the book ends with this recap. In verse 1 through 6, we have the description of the siege and the fall of Jerusalem. Verse 7 through 11, Zedekiah fleeing because the wall was penetrated, but he was captured. He was forced to witness the murder of his sons before his own eyes, and then he's blinded and dragged off to Babylon in bronze chains. Starting in verse 12, we see that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took over the destruction and the looting of the temple. In verse 13, he burned almost everything in the city with fire. Everything that Jeremiah said was going to burn, it burned. Verse 14, they broke down all the walls so that the city would be completely defenseless. And to this day, there's elements of that wall system now around Jerusalem that they're like, we think this was a wall. Think about that statement. We think this was a wall. We think the wall was here. But that's how completely the destruction does. They took it all the way down to the dirt. Verse 15, Nebuzaradan will take away most of the people, everyone who had a skill, all the artisans, he took them away. But he leaves the poorest behind, but he doesn't leave them empty-handed. He gives them the vineyards and the fields. The people who are furthest away from the levers of power will be the ones to inherit all of Jerusalem. Verse 17 through 23 has this detailed list of the items that were looted from the temple. You may want to write this in the margin, Jeremiah 28. Jeremiah 28, verses 19 through 22. Jeremiah 28, verses 19 through 22. If you remember, there was a challenge from Jeremiah in that passage. He goes, this is going to prove who the real prophet is. If nothing else is taken from the temple, then you know I was false. But if you see it taken from the temple, you know that my message was true. Verse 24 through 27, Nebuzaradan collects the priests and many of the leaders, and he has them all killed. And in verse 28 through 30 tells us that across the three waves of the exiles, Babylon took just 4,600 people into exile. And you look at that and you're like, well, that doesn't seem like a lot, and it's not. But that tells us that Babylon killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in Jerusalem. That's how many people were killed if they only took 4,600 with them when they left. But then all of a sudden we have verse 31 through 34. And in a verse like this makes no sense. We have this odd picture of grace suddenly pop up. And we previously studied this in 2 Kings 25, if you want to write that in the margin. 2 Kings 25, verse 27 through 30. 2 Kings 25, verse 27 through 30. But after 51 chapters of prophecy, the vast majority of them all against Israel, little portions here and there where it talks about this beautiful heart of God, but then it goes right back to the judgment that is to come. And all of a sudden, the last few verses of the book tells us that after Nebuchadnezzar, the king that God used to bring this judgment upon Israel, once he dies, his son is the only one ruling on the throne. His son goes and he gets Jehoiachin, that we also know as Jeconiah, who we also know as Coniah the Cursed, Jeremiah 22, he is taken out of prison. The king takes away his prison clothes. He provides for him and he elevates him. And he is allowed to eat at the table of the king. So what gives? What this is a beautiful picture of hope and reassurance to the Jews in exile. What did God tell them? Go ahead and plant trees. Go ahead and get married and live your lives because you're going to be here for 70 years. But if you will submit to the punishment, the Lord your God is with you because I have never forgotten you. That even while you are in Babylon, God still has a plan. And that what he said in Jeremiah 51:5 is true. That the people of God are not forsaken even though we have sinned. For 2 Timothy 2:13 never fails. That while we were faithless, our God remains faithful. He cannot deny himself, and he cannot deny that he is our God. Father, we love you. Lord, I praise you for this book. I praise you for the reality and the sober message of this book. But I thank you so much